Yeah, my name's Tyler Webb, located in Minneapolis, originally from Green Bay for the Wisconsin sports science in the background. I came up here for school, University of Minnesota. Right after school, I graduated. I went into freelancing. I graduated in December of 2020, and so the worst time to get a job. I had a an internship get canceled, which kind of forced my hand into freelancing the summer before my senior year, and I really liked doing it. And so after I graduated in December of 2020, I thought I'll just try this out full time. No way it can be worse than not having a job. And so I did that. I made more money than I thought I was going to make. I enjoyed it more than I thought I was, just based on the flexibility of the type of work and the schedule of work. There were just a lot of positives that came out of it. And the biggest of which was probably meeting my now business partner, Jake. We both went to school together, but didn't know of each other while in school. It took us graduating and working as freelancers separately to meet each other. And he reached out and saw I was doing social media management for clients, and he knew of a independent baseball league in the Midwest that needed some help with social management, and asked if I wanted to help. And I mean, I've been a sports fan my whole life, especially baseball, and so be able to work doing social management for a baseball league was really cool. So I said yes, and we started working on a couple other sports clients together just by way of referral. And at the end of 2021, we were doing a lot of business together, and we thought we might as well go into business together and kind of formalize this partnership that we had started. And so we started Uncle Charlie, the sports marketing agency. We do organic social media content for all of our clients. It started with us being really heavily leveraged in live sports coverage. You know, the baseball league being an example, a hockey league, a collegiate rugby organization, and then we slowly transitioned to sort of diversify our workload a bit. As you might know, working in live sports can be a slog, to say the least. So we started working with, sports training facilities and sports technology companies that had less seasonality around them, so that we could, hire better, we could prepare our work better, and just keep our sanity a little bit and not have to work in live sports year round, which is basically what we were signing ourselves up to do. So we did that, and we have been doing it for close to 3 years now. And then the summer of 2022, I sort of got the itch to create content for myself again. I was doing a lot of client content, obviously, but I felt like I had something to say in the realm of sports business, or sports marketing is sort of where I first started. And I had a lot of really bad iterations of content online, which was like day in the life of an agency owner, or tutorials about how I did things throughout the day, and none of it felt natural and none of it performed well, which made it harder to produce the content on a consistent basis. And one day I picked up a microphone and I talked about the span of bananas, and it managed to get a quarter of a million views or something like that. And I kept iterating on that concept, or that format of what would it look like for me to sit down in front of a microphone and talk about sports. And I sort of got that format to a place where it was more widely applicable and people liked watching the videos. And honestly, now, Alex, I spend more of my time as a content creator, whereas maybe 2 years ago I was like 90% agency owner and operator, and 10% doing other things, which included making TikTok content. It's now probably completely flipped, where 90% of my time is spent as a content creator. I was just out in Vegas for the Super Bowl with Sleeper, which is a brand that I work with, and 10% of my time is spent sort of helping manage the people that we have now hired at the agency, which has been a really cool shift for me, both professionally and creatively. So it's my career has looked really different in the last 2 years, but the common theme has just been doing more of the things that I like to do and less of the things I don't like to do. And I give all the credit in the world to Jake for enabling me to do those things, because while I'm off completing my side quests, he's holding down the fort for me, no questions asked, which I'm always very appreciative of.
Yeah, it's up. So I definitely want to dive into the sports business stuff and the content creation that you're doing now. But to go back to those early days, those agency days, and what you talked about, I mean, I know the feeling of kind of the college experience getting disrupted. But how much did you learn about social in that time?
Learned a lot, and I think the lens that I was able to learn it through was how to communicate what you're doing on social. I consider myself to be more of a creative person than I am a project manager type person. So Jake and I worked really well together. He's great at talking nice and giving nice political answers to clients when things aren't going well, or gassing up our results when things are going well. And I'm a bit more of a purist in the sense that I want to do the things that I think are going to work well. And early on, I didn't take outside feedback very well. And so it was nice to have Jake to sort of smooth out my rough edges. But at the same time, when I was interfacing with clients, I also had to realize that yes, there are things that I think would work well on social, but there are also considerations you have to make from a client perspective, and they're handing their brand over to you in a way that's actually a pretty like it's an exercise that requires a lot of trust. And so to think that you know best for what their brand is a little foolish and naive and maybe a little overconfident in myself at least. And so being able to understand like one, what's the lens that people are seeing this through? It's not me doing everything for them. It's me being a shepherd of their brand almost. And two, like there are just ways that you have to communicate better what you're doing. It shouldn't just be I'm doing this because I think it'll do well. Like you can extrapolate so many things from there's so many strategies or just there are ways to say better what you're doing than I'm just going to do it because I think it works and I think this is the best. And so for me it was becoming a better messenger and probably in a lot of ways a better politician for the work that I was doing. And that goes on both ends. When we were talking about the great things we were doing, we had to relay to the client why it was doing well and what the impact was on the bottom line of their business. And when things weren't going well, you had to explain away why they weren't going well and how you were going to fix it. So for me, that client experience is really invaluable because now I think it just gives me I have such a great understanding of how to talk to brands now that I'm a content creator of like what the impact of the content that I can make is. And I understand how they're thinking about it and what value propositions I should be attacking on their end because they're thinking about content in a very different way than somebody like me who's a bit more of a purist might be thinking about it.
Yeah, for sure. So take me back to the Super Bowl, and obviously that's golden time for sports media, and everything just kind of shuts down, and people descend on Vegas and take so many different approaches to content. So what was your sort of approach once you got there?
This is my first Super Bowl. I was out there with Sleeper. I do a show with them and Kurt Benkert, who's a former NFL quarterback. Does a lot of really great work. I found him first on Twitter. And I've now followed him since on Instagram and TikTok and all the rest. But he just has such a great perspective on like NFL quarterbacks in particular. That's the position he played. He was the backup for some really great quarterbacks for I think the 6 or 7 years he was in the league. Was an undrafted guy. Was a backup to Matt Ryan in Atlanta for a while during those Shanahan days. Ended his career in Green Bay, so was a backup to Jordan Love and Aaron Rodgers. So had a front row seat to that entire situation, which as a Packer fan is of particular interest to me. He's a great guy, and so just the way that he understands and breaks down the game is super nuanced and done in a way that I really appreciate. Kind of void of these like hot takes. Like he is able to hold two thoughts in his head at the same time. Where Brock Purdy may be good this week and may be bad next week. It's not like he's the best quarterback or the worst quarterback. Like people might want you to assume. So we were out there together to sort of promote the show. And I think one thing we were thinking about in terms of the Radio Row content that you hear a lot about is you get guys for 10 to 15 minutes and they have to pitch their Rocket Mortgage, State Farm, polo that they're wearing in the first 5 minutes. Then you get to ask them something that is hopefully original and hopefully not something they've already answered 10 times that day in an attempt to get some bit of content out of it. We didn't want to do that. And so, what we tried to accomplish was getting guys in a position, both, and I'll say like emotionally or at least conversationally, and then physically in a context that they might feel more comfortable. So instead of sitting down on a set in front of a microphone, there's this entire fan experience off to the side of the media row. And before it opened to the public at 3 o'clock, the media could just walk out and, there's target practice, field goals, and all these tackling dummies that you could play around with and footballs that you can throw around. And so, our idea was like, what if we can pull a couple of these guys aside and get them, with a football in their hands in a context that they feel more comfortable, and especially in the way that Kurt can talk and relate to them, being a former player himself, just kind of like get them to open up about the things they might have going on outside of football. They obviously get asked a lot about what they think about the league and their team and their own situation, but one thing that Kurt has really reminded me of, and he's a great example of this, is that these guys have lives and ambitions outside of just the game of football. And so to be able to ask them about that is one, something they probably haven't been asked about a lot. And so it's a way for them to open up. And two, they don't have to be super political when answering a question about themselves. Whereas if there's a coaching vacancy or a free agent that they might want to sign, like they have to be careful per the organization on what they say. But if they're talking about their love of video games or their ambition is to get into streaming or some clothing brand or podcast that they might be starting, they're an open book, or they're more of an open book at least. And so we talked a lot about getting content in that context that they're in a space that feels physically familiar, but then they're also opening up conversationally. And not that you want to open them up to bait and switch them at the end, but I think they're more willing to give you honest answers about other things as they feel more comfortable to talk to you. And so, Kurt was great at taking the lead on that and, helping us get into conversations that we might not have otherwise been able to.
Yeah, for sure. And so tell me about now going into, going off on your own and finding your voice on social and finding that lane in sports business. How did that all kind of start for you?
So I mentioned all the bad iterations of content that I did beforehand. And I've now realized, and this is only the benefit of hindsight that I've been able to realize this, but I wasn't checking three boxes for me when I was doing stuff that wasn't working. So I wasn't doing stuff uh, that felt like I could do it for a long time. I think there's an element of consistency that you have to bake into, especially this kind of short form content. You can't overextend yourself and make content for a week and be like, man, I'm tired. I can never do that again, because there is no end in sight. This is an unlimited type of game that we're playing. And so being able to have consistency baked into what you do is really important. And so that was not the case when I was making day in the life videos. I dreaded doing them. I hated doing them. And it was something I could have easily given up after a couple of weeks. So this type of format for me, sitting down in front of a microphone, is a much more sustainable format. To just what I felt qualified to talk about. When I look back at those early videos, like, I'm not the best video editor. I'm probably not even the best agency owner. And so to talk about those things from a position of, I know what I'm doing better than you know what you're doing, felt really disingenuous as well, and came across as really disingenuous. And so me talking about my general interest in stories and sports and business and marketing based on my experience was a much more natural fit for me. I don't think I come at it from a, hey, I know more than you. Here's what you need to do, and you need to listen to me. I like to think I'm one, curating topics. I'm not breaking stories here. I'm just kind of like formatting them in a way that's more understandable. And it's just stuff that's naturally interesting to me. And three, it was something that performed well. I think the niche specifically of sports business was underserved to an extent. Obviously, there's plenty of people that are willing to give you their take on the top 5 quarterbacks and talk about sports writ large, but the niche of the financial, the economic, the human interest side of sports, I thought was relatively undertapped. And so I think it was helpful that there wasn't a lot going on there, and so I was able to succeed, and some of these videos were able to do well. So that trifecta, or I like to equate it to a Venn diagram of, like, I'm sitting in the middle of stuff that performs well, stuff that feels natural to me, that I feel qualified to talk about, and stuff that I can talk about for a very long time. And the fact that all three of those boxes are checked, or the circles overlap in the middle for me, I think is what has allowed me to succeed.
Yeah, and tell me a little bit more about those actual videos that you're producing, because I feel like that's a part of like TikTok, and of course this goes cross platforms with just vertical videos. Those kind of in-depth explainers, like as you said, you're not necessarily breaking news, but you're really like you're breaking down these topics and making them digestible. And like, tell me about sort of that and how you've seen that sort of resonate.
Sure. So a lot of times I'm talking about pretty complex topics, or topics that aren't super interesting. And honestly, Alex, I try to stay away from the news of the moment type topics, just because I think if I can't provide an interesting angle to it that's different than the same million talking points that are going over and over and over again, I try to stay away. And it's like an exercise for me to say, okay, every time you talk about something, there has to be a different angle to it. And for me, it's just largely that sports business angle. So the Super Bowl is a great example. All this week, millions of people are talking and ingesting content about the Super Bowl. What's my angle? What's my point of difference that people want to listen to me talk about it? Because I'm not a guy that knows a lot about football, or is going to break down the game X's and O style. So, when I'm looking for topics, I'm looking for stuff that maybe isn't being talked about, or something that I think I can provide a different angle. So you looked at my Super Bowl coverage this week. It was talking about things like ticket prices, how they get the turf to the field, the technology in the stadium, the cost of ads, the future of the Super Bowl in the context of maybe making it pay-per-view, things that are probably being talked about a bit less, but at the same time, I think provide me a lane to add my commentary. When it comes to the actual topics, a lot of this stuff can be complex. It's not always the most complex, but it can be complex. One of my favorite examples to use is I made a video last year about, really the video was about urban planning. It was about like urban design and why we design spaces to be so car centric over so human centric. Is it kind of like a little rabbit hole I often find myself getting into. And I use the example of sports stadiums as the conduit to making that point about urban planning. So really the backdrop of the video was urban planning. It was about why do we design stadiums to just drive up to, sit in traffic, you tailgate for a little bit, go into the stadium, and then you leave sitting in traffic. And it's a pretty unenjoyable experience around the game. Obviously, being at the game is fun, but the driving and sitting in traffic part isn't really fun. Whereas you look in the south, the southern part of the country, especially like college stadiums, and then obviously a lot of European soccer stadiums, but a lot of southern SEC type football stadiums are really easily walkable. There's restaurants and there's bars that you can walk to, and so maybe you park your car a couple miles from the stadium, but you walk to the point where you tailgate, you can walk around, and there's energy in the air and there's places to go and bop in and out of, and there's just like this momentum or like friction that happens just walking around people that provides a much more natural feeling and a much more entertaining product than just driving in and out of. I used Arrowhead as an example because when you look at Arrowhead and Kauffman, which are the NFL and MLB stadiums that literally sit in the middle of like thousands of miles, square miles of concrete, it looks pretty void of personality and fun when it's not full. And so I try to use sports as a conduit, one, for like more complex topics, but two, like that first 3 seconds, the hook, the premise of the video is super, super important. I know a lot of people talk about that, but what I like to do is try to provide juxtaposition. That's kind of my favorite example. But even when it's something like a sports stadium where people feel like they have something to say or they have a personal experience that they can relate to, just trying to stick something in somebody's mind and then pull that thread out of them, I think is a really fun exercise. And it's how I make, all of my videos, or the most successful ones is the reason they do well, is because I can sort of plant a thought in somebody's mind. The stadium video, for example, is, I believe the hook was something like, why does every stadium look like this? And I flash a picture of, again, Kauffman Arrowhead with all the parking lot space around it. And I start pulling that thread of like, oh yeah, like I have been at a stadium before where I've been sitting in traffic and I haven't enjoyed that. And I have been to other places where I have enjoyed a little bit more, like these urban centered stadiums where I can walk around. And so, for me, it's about planting that thought. And a lot of that is done with juxtaposition and then pulling that thread and getting, maybe an interesting bit of somebody's, or, a piece of somebody's attention where they sit and ponder for a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so tell me a little bit about that thread pulling and like what your sort of process looks like for that and how much research actually goes into these things that wind up only being about 45 seconds,
Yeah, well, a lot of my videos end up being longer, and maybe they shouldn't. There's a good there's probably a point there where it's like, 45 seconds. I've had ones that are like 3 minutes long, and they probably don't need to be 3 minutes. But again, that kind of is like my natural curiosity that finds me weaving down these different paths. So in any case, the research for me really goes, again, back to that topic selection, finding angles that I think I can take. Then I just do a lot of reading. My favorite sources are like the front office sports business journals of the world. I try to get as many sources and cross check as many facts and figures. A good way to snag somebody's attention is to use some sort of like astounding or surprising figure at the very beginning. So whether like money is obviously an obvious one, but like the size of a stadium or how old something is, those are all great ways to get somebody's attention. And then I really sit and I try to work on that hook first. I know a lot of people that they'll write the thing and then they'll put the hook in front of it. I try to get that hook first because I think that if I can't find a compelling hook, no matter how interesting the entire story is, it's not a video I'm going to make if I don't think I can set it up in a way that's interesting. You don't want to be too sensationalizing and say something that's completely false, but I think there are creative ways to say something that might seem hard to believe, or maybe is hard to believe to the extent that it's not true if you take it at its face value, but only in watching the entire video does that initial hook or statement get explained. And so I'll try to my favorite way to start a video is basically like, here's something crazy, but here's this unexpected element that I'm going to a twist that I'm going to throw in. And then I get into the entire script. And like, I always find myself looking back at old scripts, and the second line always starts with something like, you see, da 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 da, or let me explain. And so people know that it's like, okay, it's like this self-aware game where I wink at the audience and I say, I know I just said something crazy and something you might not believe, but now you're going to sit back and I'm going to like be here to actually explain this for you. And I think there's a bit of trust that's built in there as well, where you have to be able to back up the claim that you just made. And maybe even being self-aware of how ridiculous the claim is a good way to build that trust. But then you can back into the rest of the script. And so when I talk about backing into the script, I think if you have a good enough hook and you have a good enough premise set up, because that's the tricky part about short form social is you can have something that's super sensationalized or super clickbaity, but if somebody doesn't understand like the context of why it matters to them, people are very selfish when they're watching. So like why, a sport, it might matter to a sports fan that a stadium is set up a certain way. They're not going to sit there and watch because they don't think the information they're about to receive is applicable to them. So you have to, in that first couple seconds, say something that's going to shock them, get them to stop scrolling, and then say something that puts it in context for why it matters to them. And then very quickly, you have to get into the information, because if you don't start backing up that information right away, people are going to say, yeah, total waste of my time, right? But I have found on the opposite end, I think a lot of people assume that to mean like, okay, I have to do that all in 15 seconds, or I have to do that all in 30 seconds. I think people are willing to stick around for, I've shown like 2-3 minutes if the information is good, and you keep giving them that same feedback loop of like, okay, I've said something sensational, I've backed it up. Now I'm going to say something sensational, or like tease something that might be sensational down the line, and then I'm going to back it up. And depending on how long your video is going to be, you might have to repeat that cycle 2 or 3 or 4 times. But if you can keep repeating and then backing up and repeating and backing up, I think people are willing to sit around for a long time. I don't think having a hook means that you have to only have a 30-second piece of information, because I really do think that consumers are looking for like dense stuff to a certain extent, and they're looking for stuff with substance is maybe a better way to put it. You just have to, I think there's a certain like base level of retention kind of hooks or retention tactic that you have to employ to keep people around. But once you hit that baseline, I think if the information is good enough, they'll stick around.
Well, yeah, for sure. I mean, it's just the content is worth the time, right? I mean, because I
Yeah,
think one of my favorite things what a professor told me, or that we kind of got down to in a conversation, was like, this new generation, it's not that they have short attention spans, they just have very good bullshit detectors. And so
exactly right.
I realize like it's not worth the time, they're gone. But if you have that hook that gets them in, and then you're able to actually back it up, that's where you can keep them on the hook for as long as you need. Um,
Yeah.
so tell me a little bit about the audience and community that you've kind of built up with all this, because um, what we do, and we're in the same realm as SBJ and FOS in terms of the content, covering the business of sports as sports media. A lot of who's reading our stuff are executives, older types that aren't on TikTok. So tell me
Okay.
about the audience that you found on TikTok that is not only coming for you for, great entertaining content around sports, but actual business of sports content.
Yeah, it kind of, I heard it said recently, I thought this was really smart, and something I don't, something I need to remember more often. It's like not every piece of content is going to serve every segment of your audience in every single way. And so there are some pieces of content where when I'm making it, I know, this is a piece is going to be widely applicable. It's going to be widely appealing. Like people, young, old, if you don't know, for whatever reason, maybe it's just a very visual concept, maybe it's not a super dense concept. This is going to be like you could even like dub it like a viral type video where it's going to have a mass appeal. And then there's other videos that I know are for my hardcore, sports marketing nerds out there, for my hardcore sports business nerds out there. And that one just probably will never do as well as something that has a super high viral appeal. And that's okay, because it's meant to target a certain subset of people. And I see that even across platforms, where on YouTube Shorts, videos have to be under a minute, which means my information has to really get distilled down, and you just can't go as deep into certain topics. So the audience tends to be younger there. On Instagram, maybe the sample size is a little too small for me. I think Instagram's kind of in the same boat as TikTok, where you talk about your audience, and like you can have demographic information. So you kind of generally know, like I generally know my audience skews majority male, kind of in that like 18 to 25 age group. But you're talking about relative numbers that are so high, like user numbers that are in the billions at this point, where even if you're only reaching 1%, 1% of 55 to 60-year-olds, you're still talking about millions and millions of people. So I try not to get too caught up in like the actual numbers of the people I'm reaching, but of course the proportions are helpful. In terms of the audience, I think what I found is that when I get to talk about my experience as a like agency owner, and I think it's kind of a differentiating factor for me, that I also have worked in the industry and a lot of people want to work in the industry, that brings out a certain like young college student professional that's aspiring to work in sports and media. or is, aspiring to work in sports business, a lot of which looks like a sales role or a marketing role or some sort of operations role for a sports team. So the fact that I get to rely on that experience from time to time, or just that I have it as a backdrop to my content, I think pulls out this sort of like young professional that I have really enjoyed, like appreciated talking to. Like when I get recognized the most, it's funny, when I was at the Super Bowl this week with Kurt Benkert, who's far and away more famous than me by any like measurable objective standard. And the producer that we were with, he was like, I think you're going to notice more than Kurt. I'm like, there's no way that's true. Like Kurt just has more followers than me. And then sure enough, you're walking through Media Row and I run into like 3 or 4 people that I know. It wasn't like they're recognizing me. It was like I reached out and was like, hey, it's good to see you. These are people that I've met online. And he's like, see, you're getting recognized so much. And it's totally different because these are people that work as a producer for Overtime, or they work in social for the Greenlight podcast. Like these are people that work in the industry, and I've connected with them on LinkedIn, or we exchange DMs because I'm just genuinely interested about where the industry is going and what kind of jobs people have these days, and how those positions are changing. And so, for me, like that sort of community of young professionals, a lot of which go all the way to as young as college students or even high school students. I just spoke at a high school sports analytics club a couple weeks ago. Like those are people that want to work in sports business, obviously, and then as old as people who are, now executives in the space. But I kind of find myself in that like professional segment of people, whereas maybe people making content about sports writ large are just falling into the lap of the casual fan. And again, I'm sure a lot of my content does fall into the lap of the casual fan, but I'm finding that my most dedicated fan base and the people that I interface with the most are people that also work in the industry.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so, tell me a little bit about strategies outside of TikTok and Instagram. So you touched on those a little bit, but you also use X, which you use in a completely different way. And then you also have those longer forms, like you have your YouTube and other channels. So kind of dive into those if you don't mind.
Yeah. So I would say my big, like what I'm focusing on this year at least is I consider the short form stuff that you mentioned, like that's just going to be the machine that keeps running. I've got it systemized down to a process where I know I can get a video out per day. I know what that takes. I know it does well to a certain extent. I have a higher level of confidence of what does well on those platforms. And so I can sort of not set it and forget it. There's even been iterations for me recently of an editing style and just trying to keep a pulse on what's working on the platforms, but I'm feeling good about that. And so now for me in 2024, it's trying to drive subscribers to my newsletter, which is long form written content, and then long form YouTube, which is a totally different type of beat or tone than the kind of short form content that I make. So, yeah, you mentioned X. I've been really active on LinkedIn for a while, and I only just started repurposing my LinkedIn content to X. But the dirty secret is that my LinkedIn content is just a repurposing of the scripting that I'm doing for my TikToks, and I post that to LinkedIn. And then, yeah, right, the LinkedIn is just or the posts on X are just another reformatting of the stuff that was going on LinkedIn already. And so I try not to duplicate efforts. That's something Frank Michael Smith, who's really talented creator. I aspire to him in a lot of ways, and I've gotten to know him really well in these last couple of years as being a creator. He continually reminds me, like, repurpose the stuff you do. And I think it's a really good reminder because I get really egotistical or caught up in my own BS where I'm like, everybody's reading everything I'm putting out. So they're going to know that this post I had on LinkedIn is just a script for a TikTok that I posted last week. But it's like, you're really hitting different segments. And back to my earlier point, I thought there was a decent question about like what my audience is. These older sports executives, they're not watching TikTok anyway. And so they're not like catching my videos anyway, where they're intaking my content, or, where these like industry professionals are intaking my content is going to be on LinkedIn. It's going to be in a different place. And it's going to have a similar effect. And it's probably nice that they get to see that part of me anyway. And I've actually seen a lot of LinkedIn just because if you're scrolling through this feed of people posting about job updates, like organic content about sports sticks out like a sore thumb in a good way. It's actually like interesting and, entertaining content, I hope. And so kind of a similar, obviously there's a huge ecosystem now of sports threads on Twitter. So I don't think I'm reinventing the wheel there, but it's just a matter of repurposing my content. And then the newsletter is very similarly, like I'll just kind of take the best scripts of the week or the best topics of the week and put them into a newsletter. And I've purposely segmented it out into 3 different sections where I have a big story and the biggest winner and the biggest loser, because they don't have to be related to each other in any way. They could be 3 distinct topics. And that's usually how my TikTok videos go anyway. So I can just reformat it there. And like there is a reformatting. I keep saying that word. There's a reformatting that happens. It's not like I'm just copy and pasting. I'm, adding bullet points and headers in a way that I think is more easily digestible across whatever platform I'm posting. But yeah, the research effort has already been done. So I might as well just keep sending it to different audiences and try to saturate as many different types of people as I can. And I honestly, I think that's probably been a really unsung reason for some of my growth and success with brands, because I'm just like perforating so many different areas of an organization that if the young social media intern brings my TikTok to an executive, that executive might have already seen my written stuff on a certain platform. And there's like a, there's a coherence in what my brand is across all these different platforms and mediums.
Yeah, no, that's really smart. And so, real quick, I want to touch on the sort of partnerships that have kind of sprung up from this. Like I saw FOS, Sports Center, Valley Sports North, and then of course what you have going on right now with SBJ. Tell me
Mm-hmm.
how those kind of all came together and what that looks like.
So I'll go chronologically. I worked with TickPick for the last 6 months, and I'll probably renew with them here shortly as we phase out of Super Bowl time. Um, I had just made a video about going to a Twins game for as cheaply as possible. They saw that. They said, it'd be a really easy integration for you to say that you bought your tickets on TickPick. We want to be associated with the cheapest place to get your ticket. So we think we could fit into that series. And we did that for 6 months. It was awesome. And that's like my favorite example to use as a way to work with a brand. They saw something, I was able to sell them on a series, basically. Like I'm not selling my soul as a creator and saying like, you get to own all of my digital likeness. You get to have a part in this series, which is really a natural integration for you. And it's a win-win because the videos do well and you get this association. So that's one that I've loved working with them. Never actually even hopped on a call with anybody from TikTok. It's just all been done over email. And we're talking about like, thousands of dollars in ad deals done over emails. And I just love when brands trust creators like that. And then there's this wave right before the NFL season where these daily fantasy apps, the Prize Picks, the Underdogs, the Sleepers of the world reached out and were offering $100 cost per acquisition bonuses. And Sleeper came in with a really competitive offer with it being their first year. And they're offering view bonuses, so bonuses for things outside of depositors. They understood. The thing I liked about Sleeper was I'm not breaking down sports. So if I were to give my pick on what Patrick Mahomes is going to do in the Super Bowl, it's going to seem really disingenuous because I never talk about the actual X's and O's of the game. But they have this ecosystem in fantasy football and in news and alerts and scores that is so comprehensive that anytime I talk about sports and I want to use, a player transaction or a score or a player's fantasy stats as like supplementary material, well, just layering in their UX and design seems like a really natural integration. And so having me just kind of like floating around with Sleeper, like every time somebody sees me, they see a Sleeper icon, or they, every time I pull up a score, it's a Sleeper score with their UI like that. That was something that was beneficial for them. And I really appreciated their sort of like full spectrum view of what it was like to work with a creator. It wasn't just like, we have to have this guy drive X amount of deposits to get our money back. Like, we see his brand as a brand we want to be associated with, and however he associates our brand, we're open to it. And so they've been awesome to work with, and I signed a year deal with them, and I just re-upped with them actually in the winter as we started doing that show with Kurt. And their commitment to like building out this media product with me and with Kurt and with the Pocket Presence, which is the show we work on together, has been really admirable, and I've really loved working with them. They really see this collaboration as a two-way street, which I appreciate. You mentioned SBJ. I think it's smart for publications like SBJ or like BSM to have organic content. They're not just talking about things happening in the industry in a written way, but they're able to kind of speak to this broader fan and have a more mass appeal with vertical video content. So they came to me and they said, "We love the way you do your videos. We'd love for you to do a couple of videos for us every month." And so that's what I do. I make some videos for them every month. I get the benefit of getting access to their really talented writers, editor-in-chief Austin, who I work with really closely, and they just do such a good job. One thing I appreciate about them is that our alignment on like the type of angle to attack content from is so good. Like I even think in the sports business industry, you go front office sports, and they're great at like getting stuff right away, right? And so like they're on social, they have a really good social strategy where breaking news, they're on it. SPJ, the thing I appreciate about them is they take a pause, they take a breath, they dive in, they make sure their numbers are correct. Not that front office sports isn't correct, but they're like taking this extra beat to get a bit more in depth and to maybe come at it from a different angle. Like I just think they're the way that they interpret and the way that they break down stuff is incredible, and it's the best in the industry. And so they're totally okay with me taking, I should say it another way. I don't have to be the first to a story with SBJ because that's not their brand. Their brand is we come at it from a more in-depth angle. facts and figures that we know are solid and are backed up. And so, um, and they have this like this horsepower of like a really solid publication that comes out every single week. And so I can pull, I'd have a million content pieces from that anyway. And so now I just get early access to it where I can make organic content for them, which has been an awesome partnership. And then trying to make sure I didn't leave anybody out. Like you mentioned Valley Sports, like that was kind of an example of a one-off where, they wanted to promote an event that was happening here in Minnesota. And so I was happy to help them do that. But yeah, I mean, for me, it really comes down to, I was always lucky to be in a position where I didn't need the money. Like I was working with the agency and Jake was letting me do this fun little side project without the side project actually making any money while still paying me my salary for working at the agency. And that's a position I know not a lot of people are in. And so I never had this pressure of like, well, I need to do this deal for $200 because I need the money. Like I could sit back and wait until the tick picks and the sleepers and the SBJs came in. And now, I work with really only like 3 brands on a consistent basis, which is great because it doesn't oversaturate my page or take away from my attention, but the brands and the products that I promote are solid and I believe in. And I think that, in turn returns for the brand, or at least that'd be my hope.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And so wrapping up here, just anything else you want to add just about what you've observed about the current state of like the social media landscape, in terms of that sports business lens, and where do you think like content is going to start shifting going forward?
So I think we're already in this shift of people. I hear it being called FaceTime content, which I have really come to appreciate. And it's this idea that you don't have to give your undivided attention to a piece of content to understand and consume it. So I think like a podcast is a great example of this. You can just have in your ear. But I think there's an element that podcast can be missing, and there's obviously a lot of visual aids and cues that could be helpful. But at the same time, like I'm thinking about this in the context of YouTube, where there's a YouTube video that I can have on and I can walk away from it with my Bluetooth headphones and I can come back to it and I'm still getting the gist of what's happening without looking at it. Or you know, I've set my phone down, I'm on the other side of the kitchen, but a TikTok's still playing and I'm still listening to it and I can still get the gist of what's happening. So whereas my editing style in the past has been very in your face, very reliant on things happening on the screen, I think I'm looking now at a slower pace of editing, something that is much more driven by storytelling and driven much less by editing style or sound effects and sensationalized visuals. And I'm trying to get back to my roots as a really good storyteller because I want to make sure that people can walk away from whatever they're doing and still listen and understand what I'm talking about. And I think there's another component too, where people don't feel like when they scroll on a video like of mine, and maybe they're a little tired, it's late at night, early in the morning, they're not in the best mood. And they're like, you know what? I just don't have the energy to consume a 3-minute video by Tyler where he's going to do a deep dive on like stadium urban planning. Like I want to make sure that I'm an easy watch too, or like a low effort watch as well. And that doesn't mean the content gets dulled down or gets less involved, but I think it just means that it's easier to consume because I'm not yelling at you. Maybe I'm a bit calmer, speaking more slowly, which is something I've had to consciously do because as you can probably tell, I can speak at a mile a minute. So it's like kind of toning down this intensity in the content that it becomes a bit of an easier watch. And I think that FaceTime style where you can do chores, you can be doing the dishes, have your phone in your pocket and still listening is kind of where this whole thing is going.